Hello and welcome to this NQA webinar, ISO 27001 Risk Assessments Explained. I'm your host, I'm Chris Smith, I'm the Principal Information Security Assessor with NQA. Just before we get going, if everyone can see my screen, the first slide screen, and hear me okay, can you just give me a quick note in the question section and then we'll begin. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks, Blair. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Oliver. Thank you. We'll make a go then. So as you can see there, NQA is a global business. We've got offices around the world. We've been in operation for over 30 years now, and we've got around 10,000 employees globally. We've handed out on average around about 36,000 certificates globally. That number's actually risen to over 40,000 certificates. Just a bit more about NQA, what we do, who we are. So there are just some of the examples of the clients we currently work with, and also our price promise there as well. So we charge an all-inclusive fee for any work inside the UK. But down onto today's session then. So today we're looking at information security risk management in line with 27001. Now, information security risk management, during this webinar, we're going to look at the things you can see on screen there. So the first one we're going to look at is information security risk management methodology. So this is the rules for conducting a risk assessment. Now, these are your rules, the rules within your business, which obviously can differ from industry to industry and also sector to sector. So just remember that as we're going through the webinar. We'll then look at identification of information security risks and what kind of things are threats or what can be classified as threats, and also vulnerabilities as well. Then we'll move on to performing information security risk assessments and what kind of things to consider when performing your risk assessments. Moving on after that, we'll look at treatment of information security risks, so what to do to control the risks. And there are 4 options available here that we will look at. It depends on how you treat the risk. Now, it's entirely up to you how you treat the risk, and again, it's based upon your industry or sector and the sensitive nature of the risk as well. And then finally, we'll look at reporting then. So how to report on a risk to avoid the risk being overlooked or deemed too complicated. So first, an outline for those of you who are new to 27001. Just what is 27001? Well, ISO 27001 formally specifies an information security management system, or ISMS, and this is a suite of activities concerning the management of information risks called information security risks in the standard. The ISMS is an overarching management framework through which the organisation identifies, analyses, and also addresses its information security risks. Now, the ISMS ensures that the security arrangements are kind of fine-tuned to keep pace with changes to the security threats, vulnerabilities, and business impacts. An important aspect in such a dynamic field, and also a key advantage of ISO 27001's flexible, risk-driven approach. Now, the standard covers all types of organisations, for example, commercial enterprises, government agencies, and non-profits, all sizes, from micro businesses to huge multinationals, and all industries as well, or markets such as retail, banking, defence, healthcare, education, and government. So it's clearly a very wide brief. So don't think that you have to be in a specific type of industry to kind of look at 27001. And it's certainly not just about IT. A lot of people say it's just an IT standard. It's more than just IT. Now, 27001 is an information security standard, as we said, and it helps companies come into compliance with international best practice models. The standard covers 3 key components of data security, as you can see on the screen there: people, processes, and technology. When steps are taken to safeguard data with these 3 components in mind, businesses are better equipped to protect information, mitigate risks, and also rectify the procedures that are deemed ineffective. Now, as such, a growing consensus has emerged in the corporate sector that deems that 27001 is the gold standard in best practice schemes. Now, by putting 27001 into effect, an organisation activates an information security management system, as we said, an ISMS, that works within the business culture of the company in question. The standards regularly updated and enhanced, and these ongoing improvements allow the ISMS to stay abreast of changes both within and outside the company, all the while spotting and eliminating new risks. Now, it's designed to support the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your information and help you maintain legal compliance. It helps you to protect your data from cybercrime, misuse, fire, theft, and all other threats, the numerous threats. Now, having a certified ISMS in place can give your customers more confidence in your company, as well as improving your relationships with other stakeholders and help you mitigate risks. So let's look at each one of those in turn. So confidentiality then. Now, a common example of confidentiality could be an online transaction conducted over secure methods, such as the use of encryption, or whereby information is protected via secure certificates such as HTTPS and other various means. Integrity, as it says, safeguarding the accuracy and completeness of assets. So an example would be the trustworthiness of customer financial account information. So think about bank accounts and personal information held by a bank for conducting daily operational transactions. And then finally, availability. Now, this could relate to a bank's customer-facing web service that hosts the online banking portal, for which customers have access any time of the day. Now, that one's quite relevant at the minute because in the news not so long ago, there was the case of one of the big high street banks, kind of their online portal went offline for a number of days, and a lot of customers couldn't get access to their online banking. So you can see there that it's very relevant in everyday life, 27001. So there are a few definitions according to ISO 27000. That is the Information Technology Security Techniques ISMS Overview and Vocabulary. So that document explains more of the wording and the vocabulary used within the standard. And you can see there we've got information security. So that's defined as the preservation of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, as we just spoke about. We've got risk, which is the effect of uncertainty on objects. Risk assessment, which is the overall process of risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. We've got risk treatment, which is a process to modify risk. And then we've got risk acceptance. This is the informed decision to take a particular risks. Now we're going to look at two key areas of the vocabulary there. We're going to look at risk assessment and risk treatment. And the assessment and management of information security risk is at the core of 27001. It's a big chunk of the standard. Now, a systematic approach to information security risk management is necessary to identify organizational needs regarding information security requirements, and also to create an effective information security management system. This approach should be suitable for the organization's environment, and in particular should be aligned with overall enterprise risk management. Security efforts should address risks in an effective and timely manner where and when they are needed. Information security risk management should be an integral part of all information security management activities and should be applied both to the implementation and the ongoing operation of the ISMS. So it's not a kind of destination, it's a journey. Okay, you never kind of stop with a risk assessment. It's a continual process. Information security risk management should be a continual process. As I said, the process should establish the internal context. It should assess the risks and treat the risks using a risk treatment plan to implement the recommendations and decisions. Risk management analyzes what can happen and what the possible consequences can be before deciding what should be done and when to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Now, information security risk management should contribute to the following things on the screen there. It should identify risks. Okay, first and foremost, we should be able to identify risks from there. Then risk are being assessed in terms of their consequence to the business and the likelihood of their occurrence. So yes, we're going to look at what risks we've got, and then we're going to say, well, how likely are they going to occur? Okay, and what are the consequences if they do occur? Then we're going to look at how do we communicate those risks? How do we make sure that those risks are made aware throughout the whole of the company? Then we need to decide, well, what's the biggest risk to the company? Which one have we got to look at first? What's the priority? And then also as well, once we've prioritized our tasks, which one do we action first? We need to get stakeholders involved. So this is the top management, suppliers, things like that. We need to get those involved in the risk management decisions. With top management, if they need to make decisions on certain things to do with risk, especially the risk treatment, then they need to be kept informed and made aware of what things we've found. We need to monitor the risk treatment. Okay, like we said, it's not a destination, it's a journey, and we need to apply the treatment of, to risks, and then make sure that it's been effective. We need to monitor the risk management process and review it regularly. Is it fit for purpose? Are we identifying risks? Are we treating them properly? And the information being captured to improve the risk management approach. So again, can we make this whole system better? And again, we go back to education, managers and staff being educated about the risks and the actions taken to mitigate them. So let's look at the risk methodology a bit closer then. Now, this is the first step on your voyage through risk management. You need to define rules on how you're going to perform the risk management because you want your whole organization to do it the same way. The biggest problem with risk assessment happens if different parts of the organization perform it in a different way. So first, we've got context. Now, this is the external and internal context for information security risk management should be established. Now, this involves setting the basic criteria for information risk management. It is essential to determine the purpose of the information risk management as this affects the overall process and the context establishment in particular. Then we have the risk management approach. So let's look at risk management approach. Now, depending on the scope and objectives of the risk management, different approaches can be applied. The approach can also be different for each iteration. Now, an appropriate risk management approach should be selected or developed that addresses basic criteria such as risk evaluation criteria, impact criteria, risk acceptance criteria. Now, additionally, the organization should assess whether necessary resources are available to perform risk management and establish a risk treatment plan. Have we got people to do it? There's no point coming up with a risk management process if you've got no one to do it or it's too lengthy. You need to have the right resources in place. We need to define and implement policies and procedures, including the implementation of controls selected. So yeah, we need to define the rules. We need to implement the rules. We need to monitor the controls, and we need to monitor the information security risk management process. As we said before, it's not a fire and forget. We need to implement these controls, monitor them to see if they're working, and then monitor the whole process as well. Is the whole process working? So from risk management approach, we move on to the risk evaluation criteria. Now, risk evaluation criteria should be developed for evaluating the organization's information security risk, considering the following things on screen: the strategic value of the business information process, the criticality of the information assets involved, the operational and business importance of availability, confidentiality, and integrity, and the stakeholders' expectations and perceptions and negative consequences for goodwill and reputation. So this is where we're kind of saying now, right, what do we define as a risk, or when does a risk become a low, go from being a low risk to a medium risk to a high risk to a very high risk? When we define the risk evaluation criteria, we need to look at the impact criteria. So this is, if we have a high risk, what is the impact of that high risk? Now, impact criteria should be developed and specified in terms of the degree of damage or cost to the organization caused by an information security event, considering the following, as you can see on the screen. The level of classification of the impacted asset. Yes, so if we've got an asset which is, let's say, if you've got a classification level of public, restricted, and confidential, let's say. If it's public, if you lose it, well, so what? It's public. It's out in the public domain anyway. If you lose a confidential document or laptop or other information asset, what's the consequences of losing a confidential asset? We need to think about breaches of information security, e.g. the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Impaired operations, internal or third parties, suppliers. Suppliers are a big information security risk. You can be as secure as you like to be within your business, but if you've got a supplier who's not as secure as you, then they're in effect your weakest link. A loss of business or and financial value. This risk materializes. Could we potentially lose business, or could we potentially lose money? Will it cost us money? The disruption of plans and deadlines. Yeah, if this risk materializes, is it going to put us back 3 months, or are we going to miss that deadline? And lastly, but by no means least, the damage of reputation. Sometimes one of the most costly impacts. If you have a breach, or if you lose some information, the damage to your reputation can be massive. We've all seen in the news recently Facebook being fined so much for not protecting people's information properly, the banks that went down and people couldn't get to their online banking. Those banks that went down, people left in their droves. So the reputational damage is massive. Once we've determined the impact criteria, then we have to look at the acceptance criteria. Now, risk acceptance criteria should be developed and specified. The risk acceptance criteria often depends on the organization's policies, goals, objectives, and the interests of stakeholders. An organization should define its own scales for levels of risk acceptance. Okay, as we said before, this is your risk assessment process. So you need to specify what you deem an acceptable risk, and it won't always be the same from organization to organization. The following should be considered during development. So risk acceptance criteria can include multiple thresholds with a desired target level of risk, but provision for senior managers to accept risks above this level under defined circumstances. So basically what we're saying here is, if you're saying you will accept all risks to a certain level, but then over that level, a director, a line manager, someone else has to authorize that yes, we've accepted that risk. The risk acceptance criteria can be expressed as a ratio of estimated profit or other business benefit to the estimated risk. We'll talk about that when we look at our quantitative and qualitative risk assessments in a bit. Different risk acceptance criteria can apply to different classes of risk. So what we deem an acceptable low risk might be very different to an acceptable high risk, and we need to define that. The risk acceptance criteria can include requirements for future additional treatment. For example, a risk can be accepted if there is approval and commitment to take action to reduce it to an acceptable level within a defined period of time. So we may say we've got a really high risk here, but in 3 months' time, we're going to reduce that to medium because we have to wait on some infrastructure work or something like that. Now, as long as you've addressed that risk and you've seen it as a risk and you're doing something about it, but it's going to take time because of financial costs or infrastructure work, that's fine. And then there are other risk acceptance criteria, such as the business criteria, the operations, the tech, the financial situation, and also social and humanitarian factors. Some risks you'll have to accept because, i.e., a secure door is a fire door. So, for example, the secure door has to remain open to everyone because in the event of a fire, people might have to go out through there. Well, that might be a risk you have to accept because of health and safety law, and obviously health and safety law will always kind of trump information security. So that's our risk methodology, and these are the rules governing how you intend to identify risk, who you assign risk ownership to, how the risks affect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, the method of calculating estimated damage of each scenario, and also the likelihood of that risk materializing. Now, the purpose of risk identification is to determine what can happen to cause a potential loss and to gain insight into how, where, and why the loss can happen. Risk identification should include risks whether or not their source is under control of the organisation, even though the risk source or cause is perhaps not evident. Identifying the risks that can affect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information is the most time-consuming part of the risk assessment process. It is. It takes a long time to do it properly. Now, if you follow an asset-based approach, and developing a list of information assets is a good place to start. But if you can find an existing list, most of the work will be done. So basically, if you can find an asset list that details all the information assets, great. It's a good place to start. What I tend to find, though, is a lot of organizations see information assets and they instantly think of laptops, PCs, hard drives. Information assets go further than that. It's anything that can store information. So that can be a document, a paper document, electronic files, yes indeed, laptops, but it can also be people. And people are by far one of the biggest risks in industry that I come across when I look at people's risk assessments. Now, an asset is anything that has value to the organisation and which therefore requires protection, as we said. The identification of assets, bear in mind that an information system consists of more than just hardware or software. An asset identification should be performed at a suitable level of detail that provides sufficient information for the risk assessment. Now, the level of detail used on the asset identification influences the overall amount of information collected during a risk assessment. So obviously, the more information you gather, the longer it will take you. The level can be redefined in further iterations of the risk assessment. As we said, the risk assessment is an ongoing process, so you can always revisit information assets on a routine basis to kind of reassess them. An asset owner should be identified for each asset to provide responsibility and accountability for that asset. Now, the asset owner perhaps does not have property rights to the asset, but has responsibility for its production, development, maintenance, use, and security as appropriate. Now, the asset owner is often the most suitable person to determine the asset's value to the organisation. And as we can see there, we've got some assets. So we've got infrastructure, like we said, the IT, the cables, the laptops, the PCs. But then we've also got people, as we said. People hold knowledge. We've got the organisation as well. We've got our processes within the organisation, okay? We've got the information itself and the application of the information. Now, if we look at threats, a threat has the potential to harm assets such as information, processes, and systems, and therefore organizations. Threats can be of natural or human origin and can be accidental or deliberate. Now, both accidental and deliberate threat sources should be identified, okay? Like we said, a threat could be a flood. That's a natural thing. You can't kind of plan that. You can't decide whether that happens or not. It's going to happen. But then you could also have someone willfully putting a virus on your system. So there's two different things there. You've got natural disasters such as a flood, or you've got malicious harm from someone. Now, as we said, a threat can arise from within or from outside the organization, and the threat should be identified generically and by type. So, for example, unauthorized actions, physical damage, technical failures, that sort of things. Then, where appropriate, individual threats within the generic class identified. Now, this means no threat is overlooked, including the unexpected, but the volume of work required is limited. Some threats can affect more than one asset. In such cases, they can cause different impacts depending on which assets are affected. And when we talk about impact here, we're talking about vulnerability. Now, input into the threat identification and estimation of the likelihood of occurrence can be obtained from the asset owners or users. So that's why we said the people who are best placed to be asset owners are the people who determine the asset's value to organization, because they will be able to tell you as well the majority of risk associated with that asset. Now, as we said, that information can be obtained from the asset owner. It can be obtained from human resources staff, for example, from facility management and information security specialists, Physical security experts can help. Legal departments and other relevant organisations, including legal bodies, weather departments, and other relevant organisations, insurance companies, government organisations, that kind of thing. That's where we should be getting our kind of our input into our threat level from. Now, aspects of environment and culture should also be considered when addressing threats. Internal experience, for instance, and past assessments should be considered also in a current assessment. So basically, we need to look at a laptop, let's say. We need to look at what are the common threats of a laptop, but then look at what's happened in the past with a business. What's happened in a company? Have we lost some? Have we left them on trains? Have we got viruses on some? So all that starts to build up your picture of how big of an impact or how big of a threat that item poses. Vulnerabilities can be identified in the following areas: unattended device, disclosure, breach of policy, theft, again, organization, processes, procedures, management routines, personnel again, physical environment. The presence of a vulnerability does not cause harm in itself, as there needs to be a threat present to exploit it. Now, a vulnerability that has no corresponding threat may not require implementation of a control, but should be recognized and monitored for changes. It should be noted that an incorrectly implemented or malfunctioning control, or control being used incorrectly, can itself be a vulnerability. So if you implement a control but implement it poorly, that can throw up just a bigger threat as not having a control in the first place. A control can be an effective and an ineffective depending on the environment in which it operates. And conversely, a threat that does not have a corresponding vulnerability may not result in a risk. Now, you must identify threats and vulnerabilities that apply to each asset. For instance, if the threat is theft of mobile device, the vulnerability is lack of formal policy for mobile devices, for example. After you've done this, you should assign impact and likelihood values based on your risk criteria, going back to what we just spoke about. You could use severity instead of impact, probability instead of likelihood, things like that. You don't have to stick to the terminology I'm using here. Once you know the rules, you can start finding out which potential problems could happen to you. Now, you need to list all your assets, then threats and vulnerabilities related to those assets. Assess the impact and the likelihood for each combination of asset, threat, vulnerability, and finally calculate the level of risk. Now, in my experience, companies are usually aware of about 30% of the risks. Therefore, you'll probably find this kind of exercise quite revealing. And when you finish, you'll start to appreciate the effort you've made. A lot of companies I go to, they always kind of come back to me and say, do you know what, Chris, before we did this, we didn't realize we had this risk or this threat. So it can be a real eye-opener at times. So this is a little example of one asset having numerous threats with a number of vulnerabilities as demonstrated. So there we've got a laptop, okay? And this is quite a crude example, but if we say, right, information asset 1, laptop, that laptop has a number of threats. Two threats there are the threat of it being stolen and the threat of malfunction. So we've got 2 threats from one asset, but from those 2 threats, we might have 2 vulnerabilities for each threat. So we can see there the theft of the threat of the laptop being stolen, the vulnerability is unattended device or unsecure premises. And likewise with malfunction, the vulnerability there is poor maintenance or software not updated. So you can see that from one asset you can get a lot of threats and vulnerabilities. And like I said, this is a very crude example just to kind of show you where I'm going with that, but you can quickly see how this risk assessment can build up. So once we've got our assets and our threats and vulnerabilities, we need to weigh each risk against your predetermined levels of risk acceptable risk, i.e. this is your risk appetite. Determine which risk you need to address and which ones you can ignore. Now, this is one of the more common examples, and I see others available, such as a 3x3 or even a 10x10, or there's numerous iterations. Like I said, however you do it, as long as it works and it works for you, that's fine. Okay, don't think that you have to do this one. I normally use this example because we've all seen the health and safety risk assessments. They use a very similar system, so why not use that for information security? Okay, you don't have to reinvent the wheel when you do this process. Make it fit your organization. So what we see here is, like I said, a 5x5 matrix with impact on the side, from 1 to 5, 1 being very low, 5 being very high, and likelihood on the bottom, again, 1 being very low, 5 being very high. From here, you can determine the overall risk rating, high, medium, or low. So basically what I'm saying there is if I get a medium impact with a medium likelihood, that gives me a score of 9, which is yellow, which is classed as a medium risk. Obviously, if I'm getting a 5 and a 5, it's a very high risk. The way I've seen it done in other places is some people would say, well, a very high impact but a very high likelihood would be the same as a very high risk overall, if that makes sense, because the impact of that risk happening, even though the likelihood is very small, if it did happen, the effect would be the same. It would still be a kind of catastrophic risk. So again, how you work that out is up to you. This is just a very crude example to kind of get you in the right kind of mindset. So then we're going to talk about quantitative and qualitative risk assessments. Now, a quantitative risk analysis uses a scale with numerical values rather than the descriptive scales used in a qualitative risk analysis, which we'll talk about in a second. For both consequences and likelihood, using data from a variety of sources, this is where we get the numbers from. Now, the quality of the analysis depends on the accuracy and completeness of the numerical values and the validity of the models used. Now, quantitative risk analysis in most cases uses historical incident data. As we said before, this is when we look back at the assets and say to ourselves, right, what has happened with this asset in the past? Now, it provides an advantage in that it can be related directly to the information security objectives and concerns of the organisation, but a disadvantage is a lack of such data on new risks or information security weaknesses. A disadvantage of the quantitative approach can occur where factual or auditable data is not available, which creates an illusion of worth and accuracy of the risk assessment. So if we've not got that data to quantify the risk, we're kind of making a guess at, well, what could the potential outcome of this be? Now, in financial terms, quantitative risk assessments include a calculation of the single loss expectancy of monetary value of an asset. The way in which consequences and likelihood are expressed and the ways in which they're combined to provide a level of risk will vary according to the type of risk and the purpose for which the risk assessment output is to be used. Now, the uncertainty and variability of both consequences and likelihood should be considered in the analysis and then communicated effectively. So if we're going to use a quantitative risk assessment, we need to make sure everyone knows what those values mean. What is it you're trying to say? So I've used an example there of one quantitative risk assessment. So we're going to say risk of the office flooding. Okay, now it's happened before, and last time it happened, it cost us £10,000 to repair. Now this happens once every 2 years. Okay, so then you calculate your annual expected loss. So the cost of repairing it is £10,000. It happens every 2 years, so annually that's 0.5. So you do the maths there, and it's £5,000. So we can say the annual cost of the office flooding is £5,000, and then you can do that for every risk you have, and you can see why it becomes a bit of a mission to get it done. Moving on to qualitative risk analysis then. Now this uses a scale of qualifying attributes to describe the magnitude of potential consequences, for example, low, medium or high, and then also the likelihood that those consequences will occur. Now, an advantage of qualitative analysis is its ease of understanding by all relevant personnel, and a disadvantage is its dependence on a subjective choice of the scale. So it's very easy to understand because you've got low, medium or high, red or red, green, amber, whatever it is. But then also that does leave it open to people making their own mind up. If you give two people a risk assessment to do on exactly the same thing, they may find the same risk, they may find different risks, but each risk may be classified slightly different because each person's perception of risk is slightly different. Now, these scales can be adapted or adjusted to suit the circumstances, and different descriptions can be used for different risks. Quality of risk analysis can be used as an initial screener, as initial screen activity to identify risks that require more detailed analysis. It can be used where this kind of analysis is appropriate for decisions, and also where the numerical data or resources are inadequate for a quantitative risk analysis. Qualitative analysis should use factual information and data where available. Like we said, if we kind of use facts, it takes away that kind of guesswork from it. Assigning probability and impacts to risk is a subjective exercise, and some of this subjectivity can be eliminated by developing rating scales that are agreed upon by the organisation. That goes back to what we said before. You've got to set your rules in stone when you start, and make sure everyone sticks to them. Now you can review them and change them as you go on, but you've got to say what a low risk is, what a medium risk is, what a high risk is. Generally speaking, an organisation must define impact and likelihood levels that are relevant to the business. Like I said, they've got to fit your organisation. Now, ISO 27001 and its supporting document, ISO 27005, do not state whether these levels should be quantitative or qualitative, high to low, 1 to 5, 1 to 100, or otherwise. What's important is that people understand the scoring in business terms. So it doesn't matter how you do it, like I've said, as long as people understand it, that's the important thing. So going back to the criteria, the impact then. Now, impact is usually measured in terms of CIA and may include financial, reputational, and regulatory impact, also information security and operational impact as well. And as going back to those three key areas again: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, once you've analysed your risks, you need to evaluate them to establish where they fit in terms of your risk appetite. So once we've found a risk, we give them a score, low, medium, high. We need to say, right, where do these fit with our business, and what are our priorities? Now, only once you've done this can you decide the appropriate way to treat each risk. This means you should be able to quickly identify your highest risks and create a prioritized list of which risks to address in which order. It's particularly important to identify whether or not the risk falls within or outside your predetermined level of risk, your acceptable risk. When risk owners say that they will accept a risk of, for example, 9, they must be prepared to accept a business situation, such as the loss of £100,000 every year, rather than the less relevant impact of 3, likelihood of 3. Okay, they need to understand if they're accepting this risk, this is the potential of what they're accepting. In practice, there is a link between impact and threat, and vulnerability and likelihood, as similar threats tend to produce impacts on a business, and similar vulnerabilities produce similar likelihoods. Now, impact types could include human, financial, legal, regulatory, reputational, and operational. Likelihood factors could include frequency of occurrence, previous occurrence, current levels of security control, size of attack group, and knowledge of the vulnerability. Now, when we talk about impact level, again, this is quite a crude example. It kind of shows you the differences between the quantitative and the qualitative risk assessment. So if we start off at the bottom there, our lowest risk, if you look at the quantitative risk assessment, well, a minor risk or minor impact, it costs a company between £0 to £1,000, or it's a minor impact, almost everyday business. Okay, we can crack on with that. Then we move up a bit, so we've gone from 0 to 1,000 now to over 1,000 to 10,000. This is a significant impact, and it may force you to look at your processes and change how you do things. Then a major impact. This is unacceptable. This is where we've got to treat it or do some organisational change likely. Again, you can see the cost going up now to above £10,000 to £50,000. And then we move up slightly more to intolerable. So significant organisational change, potential recovery. You might have an outage, you might have to recover after this impact, and the cost goes up to £250,000. And we just had a question about whether this will be available as a recording afterwards. It will, Maggie. All the webinars are recorded, and they normally go up on our website in a few hours' time, or a couple of days. However, normally with this one being on a Friday, it's normally around about Monday that it'll go up on a website. So, but you'll get notified when it goes up via email. So back to our impact level. Yeah, top level there, catastrophic, potential closure of business. So this could ruin a company, okay? And there you've got a financial figure of over $250,000. Now again, there's a crude example I put together for this webinar. You know, those costs may mean nothing to you as a business. You need to factor them in as to your business. Like I said, make it your own. It's the same with the levels on the left there, the catastrophic, intolerable, major. Make them fit your business, okay? Now, the treatment of risk comes with 4 options, and of course, not all risks are created equal. You have to focus on the most important ones, the so-called unacceptable risks. There are 4 options you can choose from to mitigate each acceptable risk. The first one being modify. Now, this is applying security controls from Annex A to decrease the risks, okay? The next is transfer the risk to another party. So you can transfer this to an insurance company by buying an insurance policy or something like that. Avoid the risk by stopping an activity that is too risky or by doing it in a completely different fashion. And then accept the risk if, for instance, the cost for mitigating that risk would be higher than the damage itself. I've seen this quite a lot where I go into businesses and look at a server rack, for example, with a lot of cables hanging out, very messy. So I always ask the question, do you not think that's a risk? You know, the cables could get pulled out, or make fault finding harder. And this is one area where companies accept the risk, because the risk of actually taking things offline to tidy that rack up is greater than the risk of just leaving it as it is. And, as long as you've assessed that risk and you've had some kind of risk acceptance, that's fine. Okay, that's all we're asking, is that you're looking at risks and addressing the risks. So with this risk treatment, this is where you need to get creative. You need to define how to decrease the risk with minimum investment. Now, it would be the easiest thing in the world if your budget was unlimited, okay? But that's never going to happen, is it? And I must tell you that, unfortunately, your management's right. It is possible to achieve the same result with less money. You just need to figure out how, okay? That's where the fun starts. So let's look at treat then. Now, treat is a process used to ensure information risks are reduced to an acceptable level. Actions should be in line with the level of risk posed to information assets, normally by adding in strengthening security controls that will reduce likelihood of vulnerability. Now, these are control measures listed in Annex A. There's 114 of them. And Clause 6.1 of Annex of 27001 describes how an organisation can respond to risk with a risk treatment plan. An important part of this is choosing appropriate controls. Within Annex A, as I said, there's 114 controls in 14 clauses and 35 control categories. These are, off the top, I'll run through these quickly. So A5 is, these are controls on how the policies are written and reviewed. A6 is controls on how the responsibilities are assigned. These also include the controls for mobile devices and teleworking policies. A7 is human resources. Now, this is controls prior to employment, during and after employment. Quite a big section there. Talks about screening of employees and things like that. A8 is asset management. This is controls relating to the inventory of assets, acceptable use, also information classification and media handling. A9 talks about access control policy, user access management, system application access control, and also user responsibilities. A10 does exactly what it says in the tin. It's cryptography. So this is the controls relating to encryption and key management. A11, so these are controls that define secure areas, entry controls, and protection against threats, equipment security, secure disposal, and also clear this policy. This is one area that I get quite a few funny looks on, because people ask me and say, Chris, what are you talking about? What do you want to know about my aircon servicing for, or my generator servicing? Well, those are all things that protect your information processing facilities. Okay, we've all got aircon in our server rooms, So you want to make sure that your aircon's working properly, because if the aircon goes down, potentially your equipment could overheat, fall over, you've lost the availability of your equipment there. So physical environmental security is a big one. A12 is operational security, so there's lots of controls here related to management of IT production, change management, capacity management, malware, antivirus backup, all that good stuff. Predominantly, this is the part of the audit which is quite IT heavy. We said 27001 is not an IT standard, but A12 is a kind of IT heavy, along with A13, which is communication security. That relates to network security, segregation, network services, transfer of information, that kind of good stuff. Although I say they're IT heavy, they're not solely IT. Okay, all these controls relate to the entire business. A14, system acquisition, development and maintenance. So this is the controls defining requirements in secure development and support processes. A15, supplier relationships. So this is controls on what to include in supplier agreements and how to monitor suppliers. So it's although not a small section, quite an important one. Supplier relationships. It's always one I tend to pay more attention to. A16, incident management. This is a controls of reporting events and weaknesses, defining responsibilities, response procedures, and also collection of evidence. This has been a really important one since the introduction of GDPR, because within A16, this is where you would define your reporting processes. So it helps with things like reporting breaches to the ICO within those limited timescales that they've brought in. A17 is the information security aspects of business continuity. So this is where we look at business continuity plans and what happens in the event of an outage or a loss of power or something like that. And then finally, compliance. So this is controls requiring identification of applicable laws and regulations. Also talks about IP, intellectual property, personal data protection, and your reviews of information security. So a lot of people ask me, Chris, how does 27001 relate to GDPR from last year? A18 compliance. You've got to kind of show what is your applicable legislation, what is your approach to meet it. Okay. Now, Annex A, as we said, 27001 sets out these 114 good practice security controls. The controls use the word should, but are neither mandatory nor exhaustive. This means that some organizations with differing risks will apply these controls to different levels of strength. Now, although 27001 doesn't require you to use the Annex A controls exclusively, you do have to check the controls you select from elsewhere against those in Annex A to ensure that each risk is appropriately mitigated. Some companies I know go above and beyond Annex A and use a lot more control measures. Others just stick to Annex A. Again, it depends on the size of your business, what your business is. Again, it's entirely up to you. Now, having selected your controls from Annex A, you need to produce a statement of applicability, an SOA. And this is one of the most important 27001 documents. Now, it should, as it says on the screen there, identify the controls you've selected to address the risk you've identified. Explain why you've selected them. Why have you done them? How have you implemented them? State whether or not they've been implemented as well. Again, it may well be that you've addressed the risk, like we said earlier, addressed the risk, but because of the time scale of getting that implemented for financial infrastructure reasons, it may not be implemented yet. And then also explain why any 27001 Annex A controls have been omitted. So if you say control measure such and such, not applicable, you've got to say why it's not applicable and be explicit as well. Don't just say we don't do that. Explain in a bit more detail what it is, because it may well be you've omitted that control, but actually thinking about the bigger picture, you do actually use it. So be explicit in your answer there. Now, there's going to be at least 140 entries in your statement of applicability, one for each of your controls, all of which will include extra information about each control and ideally link to relevant documentation about each control's implementation. Okay, that's the better ones I've seen. Now, a risk assessment report can be very long. Okay, as we said, there's numerous things you put on your risk assessment: your threat, your vulnerability, your assets. So the SOA is a very useful document for everyday operational use. It's a simple demonstration that controls have been implemented and a useful link to relevant policies, processes, and other documentation and systems that have been applied to treat each identified risk. Think of it as an index to your ISMS. Now, this document actually shows the security profile of your company as well. It's based on the results of the risk treatment you need to list all the controls you've implemented and why you've implemented them. This document is also very important because the auditor, and how I do, I'll use it as a main guideline for the audit. Because of that as well, because it lists a lot of your vulnerabilities, a lot of the controls you're using, it's a very sensitive document as well. It's not a document you'd like to be public. So keep it secure, because you wouldn't want to publish all your threats and vulnerabilities out in a public domain. So going back to our risk treatment options there, so we had treat or modify. Someone mentioned, why modify, why not reduce? Well, yeah, it's the same thing. Again, use the terminology that fits for you, really. Then we move on to share. So share generally by insuring or outsourcing. Although you would typically still suffer the impact, you can share the risk with someone better able to mitigate it, such as IT support or someone like that. Okay. Now, as an organization, you can shift ownership. You can't shift ownership of the risk. You can share it or transfer it, but at the end of the day, whoever you give it to, whether it be an insurance company or an IT support company, it's still your risk. Okay, and it's how you manage that risk. Then we have terminate or avoid. Now, this is just stop doing it. Just end the activity or circumstances causing risk. For example, by not carrying out the activity or by moving locations. Now, this occurs when there's no cost-effective action to reduce the risk. It may involve choosing an alternative activity and meet business needs. Okay. And then finally, tolerate or accept. Commonly, an acceptance by management that the risk falls within their previously established risk acceptance criteria or via extraordinary decisions. Now, this means that no additional action is required other than what is already in place, but it should be documented and communicated to senior management. Okay, so if we're going to accept the risk, like we said, that's fine, but you need to have proper justification behind it as to say why you're accepting this risk. Because at the end of the day, depending on the level of impact that risk has, it could be catastrophic. And if you're going to say, well, we'll accept that, I know if I was the MD of a company, I'd want a proper justification as to why we're accepting a high risk. So once we've looked at all the risk treatments, we create our risk treatment plan. And this is a step where you have to move from theory to practice. Now, let's be frank, all up to now, this whole risk management job is purely theoretical. But now it's time to show some concrete results, okay? This is the purpose of the risk treatment plan. Now, to define exactly who's going to implement each control, in what time frame, with what budget, etc. Sometimes I see it's called an implementation plan or an action plan. But let's stick to the terminology used in 27001 for the purpose of this webinar, the risk treatment plan. Now, once you've written this document, it's crucial to get your management approval because it will take considerable time and effort and also money to implement all the controls that you have planned here. And without their commitment, you're not going to get any of these. And this is it. That's it. You've done your risk. You've looked at your risk. You've identified your risk. You've selected controls. You made your risk treatment plan. Now it's a matter of going out there and implementing the risk treatments to mitigate those risks. And you started your journey from not knowing how to set up your information security all the way to having a very clear picture of what you need to implement. The point is, ISO 27001 forces you to make this journey in a systematic way. And that's it. One of the things I do tend to see it done well is when people have used the risk assessment, if they've got a health and safety management system in place, let's say, they've used the same risk assessment, but obviously tailored it to information security. Again, don't reinvent the wheel with this. It's a simple process that can be very quickly overcomplicated. So thanks for listening. We've got a bit of time left now for some questions, if any of you have got some questions. I hope the questions did pop up during the webinar I've answered as we went on. I know there's a couple. Has anyone got any questions before we finish? The webinar is going to be available as a recording afterwards, as we said. This is the third iteration of this webinar now, and if we do start getting similar questions, we'll create a frequently asked questions blog to join this webinar, so you can review that as well. So we've just had a few questions come through. So can qualitative and quantitative be used together? Again, like we said, it's your webinar. It's your risk assessment. How you do it is entirely up to you. But the main thing is you need to be able to make the business understand what it is you're trying to achieve. So if you're going to use qualitative and quantitative together, some people will be saying it's the low risk. Others will be saying, well, it's going to cost us £5,000. You could say it's a low risk, it'll cost us £5,000, you know. So, but again, it's up to you. If you want to use qualitative and quantitative together, that's fine, but you need to ensure that the criteria, the rules are tied down so that people can't go elsewhere. I think if you use both, it would leave it open to a high level of subjectivity. Okay, Oliver. Yeah, I've got that. I've got your statement there. Thanks for that. So there's no more questions coming through. We'll pull to a close there. If you do think of any more questions in the meantime, please feel free to email them in at nqa@nqa.com. In the meantime, please go and have a look at our brand new website. It's got a lot of material on there with information security and risk assessments. If you've got any comments, please again feel free to email them in. Thanks for that, Carl. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.